The afternoon sunlight streamed through the classroom windows as I gathered my notes, trying not to notice Professor Mason glancing my way. Just as I stuffed my notebook into my bag, his voice cut through the soft chatter of students leaving the room. "Ryan, could you stay behind for a moment?" My stomach flipped. The usual calm I felt around him suddenly replaced by a nervous energy. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound casual. As the last student left, he shut the door with a soft click. I was alone with him now. Mason moved closer, his dark eyes unreadable. "You've been doing great work lately?" Really impressive. His voice was low, almost too casual. I shrugged, feeling the tension. "Thanks, Professor." He leaned against the desk, crossing his arms, eyes never leaving mine. "There's something else." A pause hung between us. "I think we should talk somewhere more private." His words were smooth, deliberate. My heart thudded harder in my chest. "Private," I echoed, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded. Follow me. Without another word, he turned and headed for the door, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. Curiosity and something else had me following him out of the classroom, my steps quickening to keep up. Mason led me down the hall, away from the usual student-filled corridors. My mind was racing, my steps quick and hesitant. We moved past empty offices until he stopped in front of a door I'd never noticed before, small, tucked away. He unlocked it, glancing back at me with a faint smile. "After you." I stepped inside, my heart pounding louder than my footsteps. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the afternoon outside. It felt too intimate, too deliberate, and suddenly I wasn't sure what I'd gotten myself into. Mason closed the door behind us, the sound barely a whisper. He walked past me and settled into one of the chairs, gesturing for me to do the same. I stayed standing, arms crossed. "What's this about?" I asked, forcing the words out even though my throat felt tight. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, eyes flicking up to meet mine. "I've noticed something, Ryan. The way you stay behind after lectures, the way you look at me." His voice dropped, soft but certain. "It's not just about the class, is it?" I froze. There it was out in the open. No turning back now. My pulse kicked up again, and I tried to play it off with a shrug, but my mouth was too dry for words. "I don't pretend," Mason continued, his tone steady, challenging. "You know what I'm talking about." I swallowed, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "What do you want from me?" A silence hung in the air, thick with everything unsaid, until he stood, crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps. When he reached me, he stopped just close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him. "I think you already know," he murmured, his voice low. His hand brushed against mine, sending a jolt through me. Suddenly, the air felt different, charged, alive. I didn't move. Neither did he. The question wasn't whether something was happening between us, but how far it would go. The tension between us hung in the air, thick and heavy. Mason's hand lingered near mine, just close enough to send sparks through my skin. I stood frozen, not daring to move. He waited, watching me carefully like he was waiting for me to give something away. "Say it," he finally murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to hear it from you." I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. But what could I say? That I'd been staying late just to be near him? That I'd thought about him more than any student should think about their professor? My voice faltered, but there was no escaping this moment now. "I feel something for you," I admitted, my chest tightening. "I don't know what to do with it. I don't know what to do with it." His eyes flickered, something dark and unreadable passing through them. He stepped even closer, the space between us disappearing. "You think I haven't noticed? You think I haven't felt the same?" My breath caught in my throat. Whatever I had imagined happening between us, hearing him say it aloud made it real in a way that terrified me. "You don't have to say anything else," Mason whispered, his voice softer now, almost soothing. His hand reached up, grazing my arm, and I felt my entire body react to his touch. "I just want you to know. I felt it too." I stared at him, not sure if I should pull away or lean in. "What happens now?" His lips curved into a small smile, a look that was more dangerous than comforting. "We don't rush, we take this slowly. I'm not about to let something like this slip away, but we need to be careful." Ryan, his hand slid down, barely touching mine, but enough to make my heart pound. I nodded, unable to find my voice again. The room felt too small, too intimate, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to escape it anymore. "Are you ready for that?" he asked, his voice low, almost daring me. I swallowed, meeting his gaze head on. Yes. That single word seemed to change everything. Mason's eyes darkened, and he took another step closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was already answering the question I hadn't dared to ask. "Good," he whispered, his voice a mix of promise and restraint. Then, without breaking his gaze, he added, "Because this is just the beginning." There wasn't time to process his words before Mason's hand reached up, fingers brushing my jaw. My breath hitched, but I didn't move. His touch was deliberate, slow, almost like he was testing my reaction. "We can stop right here," he said, his voice soft but with an edge to it. His eyes searched mine, looking for hesitation. But I didn't want to stop. I could feel the line between us blurring, and despite the nerves, there was a pull I couldn't deny. My heart was hammering in my chest, but my body stayed rooted to the spot, leaning into him without even realizing it. I don't want to stop, I said, surprising even myself with how steady my voice sounded. Mason's gaze darkened, a flicker of something intense flashing behind his eyes. You're sure? I nodded, the space between us shrinking until there was none. His hand cupped my face now, his thumb tracing a slow line over my cheek. There was no hesitation anymore, not from either of us. All right, he murmured, and that was the only warning I got before his lips crashed into mine. It wasn't gentle or careful like I'd imagined. It was heat and urgency like we'd both been holding back for too long. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. I responded, my hands gripping his arms, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles. The kiss broke for a split second, just enough for both of us to catch a ragged breath. His forehead pressed against mine, our breaths mingling in the charged air between us. We shouldn't be doing this, I whispered, but I wasn't pulling away. Neither was he. No, Mason agreed, his voice low and rough, but here we are. There was a hunger in his voice now, and I felt it mirrored in myself. He leaned back in, this time slower, more controlled. The intensity was still there, but now it was deliberate, like he wanted to savor every second of this. His hand slid down my back, pulling me against him. The heat between us was undeniable now, and any second thoughts I had were lost in the way he kissed me, like he needed this as much as I did. Suddenly he pulled back, his breathing uneven, eyes locked on mine. We need to be careful. I nodded, trying to calm the racing thoughts in my head, but the way his hands gripped me, the way he looked at me, it felt like we'd already crossed a point of no return. Careful, I repeated, though I wasn't sure either of us believed it anymore. Mason's lips curved into a knowing smile. Let's just see where this goes. He stepped back slightly, giving us both space to breathe, but the air between us was still thick with tension. This wasn't over, it was just beginning, and we both knew it. The days that followed were a blur, but not in the way I expected. We didn't talk about what had happened in the private room, not explicitly. There was no need. The air between us had changed, thick with unspoken understanding. In class, Mason was as professional as ever, but I caught the looks, the ones that lingered just a second too long. Every time his eyes found mine, my pulse quickened, memories of his lips on mine flashing back. I could tell he felt it too. There was a tension that hadn't been there before, something simmering just below the surface. One afternoon after class had cleared out, I was packing up my things when his voice cut through the silence. Ryan, stay for a moment. I froze. It was the same casual tone he'd used the first time, but now the meaning was different. Without a word, I nodded, the familiar swirl of nerves and anticipation settling in my chest. The last student filed out, leaving us alone again. Mason walked to the door, casually turning the lock. The sound of it clicking echoed in the empty room. My throat went dry. Do you have any idea what you're doing to me? He asked, his voice low, more intense than before. He stepped toward me, closing the distance in just a few strides. I swallowed hard, but the words I wanted to say stuck in my throat. I couldn't speak, not with him looking at me like that, not with the memory of his hands on my skin so fresh in my mind. You're driving me insane, he continued, his hand brushing my arm, his touch light but sending a shiver through me. Every time I see you, every time you look at me. I didn't mean to, I started, but he cut me off. You don't have to mean to, Ryan. It's happening. Whether you want it or not, his eyes locked onto mine, and the air between us felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it came out shakier than I intended. So, what now? Mason's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, but there was no amusement in his eyes, only intensity. Now, we figure this out, but we have to be smart. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what smart looked like in a situation like this. Every nerve in my body was on edge, but it wasn't fear, it was something far more dangerous. The thrill of knowing what we were risking, and that neither of us seemed to care. Can you handle that? He asked, stepping even closer, his voice almost a whisper now. Because once we start this, it's not going to be easy to stop. I held his gaze, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I can handle it, I whispered, my voice steady this time. Good, Mason murmured, his hand sliding up to my neck, fingers curling behind my head. He pulled me into another kiss, slower this time, more deliberate. It wasn't just about the heat, it was about control, about knowing that this was real. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the space between us. This stays between us, he said, his voice low but firm. Of course, I replied, my heart pounding. I wasn't stupid. I knew the stakes, but something about being here, in this moment, made the risk feel worth it. Mason smiled faintly and stepped back, the tension easing but not disappearing entirely. We'll be careful, he repeated, though we both knew that careful didn't quite fit where this was headed. See you tomorrow, I said, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth as I turned to leave. Tomorrow, he echoed, his eyes following me as I walked out of the room. The next day came like a slow burn, tension building every minute, until the final class ended. My mind raced through everything that had happened so far, the way we'd left it hanging in the air. But today felt different. The careful distance we'd tried to keep was gone. As the classroom emptied, Mason's eyes found mine again. It wasn't just a glance this time, it was a signal. The last student filed out, and before I could second-guess myself, I was walking toward him, every step heavy with unspoken intent. You ready? He asked, his voice low and even. It wasn't a question about staying late for extra help. Yeah, I replied, keeping my voice steady, though the pulse in my neck betrayed me. My heart was pounding, but I wasn't backing down. He motioned toward the door. Not here, his tone was casual, but I caught the undercurrent. He was walking a fine line, keeping it professional when we both knew what was coming next. Follow me. We left the building, cutting across campus without a word, heading toward the faculty offices. My mind was racing, each step making this feel more real, more intense. I followed him to a building that was quieter, away from where anyone might notice us together. He led me up a back staircase I hadn't seen before, to a floor where the hallways were empty. When we reached a door, he unlocked it with a smooth, practiced motion, and I knew this was planned, deliberate. Inside, it was a small office's office, I realized. The door clicked shut behind me, and the quiet swallowed us whole. The air was thick, filled with something I couldn't name but could feel deep in my gut. Mason turned toward me, his face unreadable, but his eyes told me everything. We're alone now. I nodded, the weight of the moment settling in. I know. He crossed the room, standing in front of me, his presence filling the space. His hand reached up, this time with no hesitation. He ran his fingers lightly through my hair before letting his hand fall to the back of my neck, pulling me in slowly. There was no asking anymore, just the silent understanding that this was happening. Our lips met again, but it wasn't rushed. This time it was slow, controlled, like he was savoring the moment. I responded, letting myself give in fully all the tension of the past weeks unraveling between us. His hands roamed, firm but patient, his touch igniting every nerve. I broke the kiss just enough to whisper, "Is this what you want?" Mason's response was immediate, his breath hot against my skin. "I've wanted this for a long time, Ryan." The confession hit me harder than I expected, but before I could process it, his lips were on mine again, more urgent now. I felt my body press against his, the heat between us rising. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer, and I could feel his desire, raw and real, matching my own. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, the pull between us too strong to resist any longer. His lips moved to my neck, sending a shiver down my spine as he whispered, "Tell me to stop if you need me to." I didn't hesitate. "Don't stop." The words barely left my mouth before his hands moved lower, gripping me firmly, his touch electric. I could feel the tension building inside me, but there was no turning back now, not for either of us. We stumbled toward the desk, his mouth never leaving mine, and in the haze of everything happening, I realized just how far we were willing to go. This wasn't about careful anymore. It was about us here, now, and everything we'd been holding back. The lines were long gone, and we were crossing into something neither of us could undo. But in that moment, I didn't care. We were already too deep. The next few days felt like living in a dream, one where the edges blurred and reality and fantasy bled into each other. Mason and I kept our distance in public, careful to keep things looking professional, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. It wasn't just the stolen kisses in his office or the late nights where the lines blurred further. It was the way we spoke, the way we looked at each other. The tension never left. Even in the most mundane moments, it was addictive, thrilling yet dangerous. But it couldn't last unnoticed. One afternoon after class, I felt it, the stares, the whispers. As I gathered my things, I overheard a conversation nearby, two students talking in hushed tones, their glances darting toward me. My stomach twisted. "You think they're," one of them murmured. The other shrugged. "Something's off. He's always hanging around after class, and Mason looks at him different." My heart sank, a chill creeping up my spine. I kept my face neutral, my movements slow and deliberate as if nothing had changed. But inside, panic was rising. I hadn't been careful enough. We hadn't been careful enough. I waited until the room cleared, trying to shake off the unease, but it clung to me like a shadow. When the last person left, Mason approached, his usual composed expression in place, but I could see the question in his eyes before he even asked it. "You all right?" he asked, his voice lower than usual, his concern barely masked. I glanced toward the door, making sure no one was near. "People are talking," I said quietly, my voice tighter than I intended. "They've noticed?" He didn't react right away, just stood there processing it. Finally, he let out a breath, stepping closer. I figured it might happen eventually. People notice things. "Yeah, well, I didn't think it would happen this soon," I muttered, anxiety gnawing at my insides. I had tried to play it cool, but now I wasn't so sure. Mason placed a hand on my arm, his touch steady. "Relax. We knew this wasn't going to be easy." I pulled away, pacing the small space, my mind racing. "Easy? This is a mess. If they find out," I stopped, meeting his gaze, my chest tightening. "What if they find out?" He stepped in front of me, gently stopping my frantic pacing. "They won't. We'll be more careful." His voice was calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, worry, maybe even guilt. "I don't know if that's enough," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The weight of the situation was pressing down on me now. This wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a risk, and not one I could afford to take lightly. Mason's hand slid up to my neck, his touch grounding me, his thumb brushing my jaw. "Ryan, look at me." I did, meeting his eyes, and for a moment everything else fell away. The whispers, the rumors, the fear, it all faded under his steady gaze. "We'll be fine," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I won't let this get out of control, I promise." I wanted to believe him, but the tension in my chest wouldn't ease. What if it already has? He shook his head. "It hasn't. Trust me." His hand dropped to my arm again, squeezing gently. "We just need to be smart." I nodded, though the knot in my stomach remained. Yeah, smart, but the truth was, the more we tried to hide, the more it felt like we were walking a tightrope, and one wrong move could send everything crashing down. Mason leaned in, his lips brushing my ear as he whispered, "Meet me tonight, we'll talk." I swallowed, the heat from his breath still lingering on my skin as I nodded. "All right?" He stepped back, his eyes scanning the room one last time before he walked out, leaving me standing there, torn between the pull of what we had and the growing fear that it was all about to fall apart. As the door clicked shut behind him, I couldn't help but wonder if it already had. That evening, I found myself outside Mason's office. The hallway was deserted, the building quiet, too quiet. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat a reminder of the risks we were taking. Every step toward that door felt heavier than the last. When I knocked, the door opened almost immediately. Mason was waiting for me, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders was clear. Without a word, he stepped aside to let me in. Once the door clicked shut behind me, the silence between us felt louder than it should have. We were both on edge now, like we'd reached the point where pretending things were still under control wasn't enough. "You said we needed to talk," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, barely filling the space between us. Mason leaned against his desk, arms crossed, his gaze flicking to the floor for a moment before meeting mine. "I overheard the whispers today," he said, his voice low. "It's worse than I thought." I swallowed hard, the knot in my stomach tightening. "So what do we do?" He looked at me for a long moment, his jaw clenched. "We lay low. No more late meetings. No more." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "We have to be smart about this." His words stung, even though I knew he was right. Still, the thought of pulling back, of losing what we had, hit me harder than I expected. "So what? We just stop?" Mason's eyes flashed with frustration. "I didn't say stop. I said we need to be careful." He stepped toward me, closing the distance between us, his voice softening. "Ryan, I'm not willing to throw this away, but we can't keep pretending like it's not dangerous." I felt a surge of anger rise up. I know it's dangerous. I've known that from the beginning. But now I stopped, trying to gather my thoughts, but the fear of losing this was clouding everything. Now it feels like we're already caught, like it's just a matter of time. Mason exhaled sharply, running his hands over his face. "Look, if you want out, say it. I won't hold you here." The room went still, the words hanging in the air between us like a challenge. Did I want out? Part of me wanted to walk away, avoid the crash I felt coming. But another part of me, the part that had been pulling me toward him from the start, couldn't. "No," I said, my voice firm. "I don't want out. I'm just scared." He softened then, his hand reaching out to cup the back of my neck. "I'm scared too," he admitted quietly, his forehead leaning against mine. "But we have to be smarter about this." I nodded, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine, grounding me in the moment. "All right, so what do we do?" His grip tightened slightly, his voice steady. "We back off for now. No more late nights, no more meetings in my office." I pulled back slightly, frowning. "How is that going to work?" "We'll find a way," Mason replied, though his tone was laced with doubt. "It won't be easy, but if we want to keep this, we don't have a choice." I stepped back, trying to process the weight of his words. "So we just hide? Pretend nothing's happening? Until the heat dies down?" "Yes," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "I don't like it either, but if we're going to survive this, it's the only way." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Survive. That's what this had turned into now, surviving. I wasn't sure how we'd gotten here, but there was no denying the shift. This wasn't just about sneaking around anymore. It was about keeping something fragile alive before it shattered under the pressure. I turned toward the door, my hand on the handle, hesitating. And after the heat dies down, Mason's voice was soft but firm behind me. "We'll figure it out." I nodded, pushing the door open, the cool air from the hallway hitting me like a reminder of everything waiting outside. Before I stepped out, I glanced back at him, his face shadowed by the dim light of his office. We were both trapped now, caught between what we wanted and what we knew we couldn't have, at least not openly. I closed the door behind me, the sound echoing down the empty hall. We were playing with fire, and I wasn't sure how long we could keep from getting burned. Laying low sounded easy in theory, but in reality it was suffocating. The days passed with awkward silence between us in class, our usual glances carefully avoided. We'd built this connection, this heat, and now we were pretending it didn't exist. It felt like trying to hold back a flood with nothing but a few flimsy walls. I tried to focus on my work, burying myself in textbooks and assignments, but everything reminded me of him. Every question I had about the lecture, every comment he made, it all felt charged with the weight of what we weren't saying. A few days later, as I headed to the library to finish an initial assignment, I felt eyes on me again. It wasn't the normal whispers or curious looks this time. It was pointed, like people knew, like something had slipped. I glanced around, heart thudding in my chest, and caught the sight of two girls whispering and looking my way. Panic swirled in my gut. By the time I made it inside the library, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Everything was closing in. The secrecy, the distance, it was all starting to crack. I pulled out my phone and, without thinking, texted Mason. "Me, we need to talk. I can't keep doing this." I didn't expect a response right away. Maybe I was hoping he wouldn't reply at all, that I could shove this feeling back down, but within seconds, his reply came. "Mason, meet me in the lecture hall. Now." A knot tightened in my stomach. He was just as on edge as I was. I made my way to the lecture hall, feeling the weight of every step, the pounding of my heart louder than the footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. When I arrived, Mason was already there, leaning against the desk, arms crossed, his expression tense. The door clicked shut behind me, and for a moment, the silence between us felt like it was going to crush me. "I can't do this anymore," I blurted, my voice tight. "I can't pretend like everything's fine. People are talking. I feel like I'm being watched all the time." Mason straightened, his jaw tight. "I know. It's been rough, but we're doing what we have to." "Are we?" I shot back, the frustration boiling over. "Because right now, it feels like we're just waiting for everything to blow up." His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time in a while I saw something flicker there, something vulnerable. "What do you want me to do, Ryan?" "Tell me." I swallowed, caught off guard by the sudden rawness in his voice. "I don't know," I admitted, the words feeling too small for how big this all felt. "I just know this distance, it's tearing me apart." Mason stepped closer, his hand brushing mine, the contact sending a jolt through me. "You think it's any easier for me? Do you think I like this? Watching you from across the room, knowing we're acting like strangers." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. The frustration, the anger, it was all coming from the same place. We were trapped, both of us, by the same thing. "I hate it," I whispered, feeling the emotion bubbling up, the walls cracking even further. "But what's the alternative? If they find out?" Mason's hand closed around mine, gripping it tightly. "If they find out, we deal with it together." I stared at him, searching his face, trying to find some sense of certainty. "Together." He nodded, his grip tightening. "Together. But right now we need to be smart. We need to play this carefully." I pulled my hand back, pacing the small space, the weight of it all pressing down on me. "I'm scared," I admitted, the words falling out before I could stop them. Mason's voice softened. "I know, so am I, but you have to trust me." I stopped pacing, turning to face him. "Trust you? I don't even know if we can trust this anymore." The words hung between us, thick with tension. Mason took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you still want this?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then we make it work," he said, his tone steady now, as if he was trying to will it into reality. "We take it one day at a time. We don't let them tear us apart." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest, torn between wanting to believe him and the fear that we were already on borrowed time. And if it all falls apart? Mason's eyes darkened, his voice lowering even further. "Then we deal with that when it happens. But we're not giving up. Not yet." I nodded, the tension in my chest easing just a little. But even as I stood there, feeling the heat of his presence and the promise in his words, I knew this wasn't over. We were walking a dangerous line, and the cracks were only getting bigger. The cracks finally broke wide open 2 days later. I was sitting in class, pretending to focus on Mason's lecture, but my mind was 1,000 miles away. The tension was unbearable, like something was about to snap. Every whisper, every sideways glance from my classmates felt like they were staring right through me, like they already knew everything. Then, it happened. I heard it before I saw it, footsteps in the hallway, louder than usual. The door swung open and 2 figures walked in. One of them I recognized immediately. The dean? My stomach dropped. Mason stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the door. "Can I help you, Dr. Stevens?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge. Dr. Stevens didn't waste time. "Professor Mason, I need a word. Now." The tension in the room shifted, the air suddenly thick with confusion and suspicion. The students glanced between each other, murmuring, already sensing something was wrong. I felt my throat tighten as Mason set his chalk down, his face carefully neutral, but I could see the flicker of something in his eyes, concern, maybe fear. He knew, just like I did. "I'll be right back," Mason said, giving the class a nod before following the dean out into the hall. The door clicked shut behind them, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I sat there frozen, my heart racing in my chest. They knew. They had to. There was no other explanation for why the dean would pull him out of class like that. My mind spun with panic, thoughts crashing into each other with no clear direction. Minutes felt like hours. And then, suddenly, the door opened again. This time, it was only the dean who entered. Mason wasn't with him. The dean's eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on me, I felt every muscle in my body tense. "Ryan," he said, his voice flat. "Could you come with me, please?" Every eye in the room turned to me. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear anything else. I nodded, forcing my legs to move, though they felt like they'd been turned to stone. The walk to the door was the longest walk of my life. and when I stepped into the hallway, the cold air hit me like a slap. Dr. Stevens closed the door behind us, his face unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, motioning for me to follow him. I didn't argue. We walked in silence down the corridor, each step echoing louder than the last. The whole time, my thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear, regret, and panic. Where was Mason? What had they found out? What was going to happen now? We finally reached his office, and when the door closed behind me, the sound of it felt final, like the end of something I hadn't been ready to let go of. Ryan, Dr. Stevens began, sitting behind his desk, his fingers steepled as he looked at me. "I think you know why you're here." I swallowed hard, my voice failing me for a moment. I don't know what you mean." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "Let's not play games. We've received complaints, concerns from other students, from faculty, rumors about your relationship with Professor Mason." The floor felt like it was falling out from under me. "Rumors," I echoed, though the word felt hollow in my mouth. "Is there any truth to them?" His question hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. I felt my chest tighten, the panic rising again, but I forced myself to stay calm. "No," I lied, my voice barely a whisper. "There's nothing going on." Dr. Stevens studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Ryan, I'm giving you a chance to come clean. If you don't, this could get very messy for both of you." The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing down on me. I could see it unraveling, everything Mason and I had tried to keep secret, everything we built, falling apart piece by piece. My mind raced, but the truth was too dangerous, too real. "I'm telling you," I said, my voice trembling, "there's nothing between us." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Very well. But know this, Ryan, if the investigation finds anything, there will be consequences, serious consequences." I nodded, my heart sinking. "I understand." When I left his office, the weight of it all crashed down on me. The secret was out, and even if I hadn't admitted it, the truth was closing in. Mason was nowhere to be found, and as I walked through the now empty hallway, I realized that everything had changed. We had crossed too many lines, taken too many risks, and now the fallout was here. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew there was no going back. Whatever came next, we would have to face it together if we could.